Thank you very much, Sean. Really appreciate that introduction. And thank you for always being there in the background, assisting us with questions and also helping us with the actual system. So a very good morning to all of our attendees this morning, and a very big thank you to our sponsors, FEM and IOPSA. And we'd also want to say thank you very much to SIOSH for accrediting these Toolbox Talks with that CPD point. As always, Tuesday morning Toolbox Talks, and also being the first of the month, we do have a how-to Toolbox Talk. In other words, we actually take you through the step-by-step procedure of how to do the very thing that we are speaking about. So every first of the month, we will have this, and that is the reason for the actual handout that you have. So please go ahead and take that handout. Please drag and drop it onto your desktop, or maybe click on it and just copy it down. Download that if you can. You can do this on your phone, tablet, or laptop. And then maybe go ahead and open it up in a separate windscreen or a separate window so that you can actually go through the risk assessment as we're discussing it. For those of you who are actually health and safety professionals, you might want to use your own risk assessment, and then also give us feedback on how you go about performing your risk assessments. And please, if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, we'd love to hear from any of you. But as this is for the IOPSA members, we want to tailor make these Toolbox Talks directly for you. So we are going to be speaking about the installation of a geyser this morning. So if you are a plumber out in the industry, or perhaps you're a health and safety consultant for plumbers, the question that always arises is, why do you need a risk assessment every time you do a different task? Well, let's go through the basics. What are risk assessments and why are they so important? Well, a risk assessment is the term used to describe the overall process or method where you, one, identify hazards as well as the risk factors that are attached to those hazards, and then also the potential hazards. So not just existing things, such as if you grinding, then you have hot works, but also the potential hazards in and around the environment that you are working in. And this is what we call site-specific risk assessments. The second thing we want to do once we've identified these hazards and evaluated the actual risks is now to analyze and evaluate the risks that are associated with these hazards. And this is what we call risk analysis or risk evaluation. Now, why is this so important? Well, for one, it takes us through a step-by-step method of identifying what could go wrong, what is the source of the problem that is actually creating the hazard for us, and then how can we go about stopping that from becoming an incident or an accident in the future. So can you see the need for risk assessments? And can you see why it's so important to have a risk assessment procedure? Well, we have spoken about risk assessments in the past. In fact, early in 2018, we also had a HIRA Toolbox Talk, which was hazard identification risk assessment, just as an awareness. And then a little bit earlier this year, we had the continuous risk assessment Toolbox Talk, where we actually gave you a template of a DSTI, or a daily safe task instruction, which for some is like a mini risk assessment that is generally done before a task is completed. But today we want to talk about a task-based risk assessment. And that is the risk assessment template that we've given you in the handout. So how do you perform this type of task-based risk assessment? Well, let's first identify what it is. This is a risk assessment that is developed to identify the specific hazards associated with a specific task. Well, it's all in the name. Task-based or task-specific risk assessment. So as we mentioned, we're going to take the installation of a geyser and design our Toolbox Talk around this. So what do we do? How do we go about actually performing a risk assessment? Well, if you've got the template downloaded, or perhaps you're using your own template, or even if you want to go and open up a empty Word document or Excel spreadsheet and write down these steps. If you'd like this Toolbox Talk information in PDF format, we can also send that through to you, or in a slideshow, just as the content. You're more than welcome to ask us, and we will send you some more information on risk assessments. But you always start with a step-by-step method of how you, the person performing the task, would go about the actual installation. Now, why is this very important? Well, for one, we want to list the steps of installation so that we can now start isolating individual hazards and then the multiple risks that are associated within that hazard identification. So how do we explain this to you just in general? When we perform a risk assessment or a risk analysis, it's extremely important to know the task that you are performing. Now, what if you are not the person actually performing the task? Well, then you need to design a risk assessment team. Now, generally, this is for a little bit larger or slightly bigger organizations where they have the resources and the manpower to have a risk assessment team. But it's always a good idea to factor in the knowledge and experience that employees who are actually performing the tasks have. So if you are designing the risk assessment on a laptop in an office, well, you are not faced with the actual installation in front of you. So you might miss a few things. So a site inspection is always the most important thing. Doing a risk assessment on site is going to help you to fill the gaps of the template that you've already designed. But even more than doing the site inspection is speaking to the individuals involved in actually installing that geyser. See, they're going to pick up a few things that you may have missed, or perhaps you might have picked up something that they have missed, and thus they will learn from the risk assessment and see how it's done safer. So let's do this now. Let's try and complete a basic risk assessment for the above installation of a geyser and see a step-by-step procedure of how to go about it. Now, at the end of this toolbox talk, you're not going to have a fully designed risk assessment, but you will have an outline or a skeleton of how to go about designing your risk assessment for something as simple as the installation of a geyser. Now, if I've missed anything, please, if you are installing geysers, why not drop us a comment or a suggestion and say, well, we noticed these few things or these few gaps from the toolbox talk, and then we will add it in to the information that we have for you as plumbers. So initially what we want to do, as we mentioned, is just list those steps. It's extremely important to make a list or to make an actual diagram of how we go about performing our tasks. Very important to never forget legal compliance. And this is the setting up of inspection of your tools, making sure you have the correct registers for the types of tools you are using, the types of equipment that you are going to use. If it is going to be a hazardous chemical substance, as we discussed last week, make sure you have your MSDS and your hazardous chemical substance registers. If there's different types of equipment that you're going to be using, such as scaffolding or ladders, well, these also need to be taken into consideration. So these types of compliance steps will all be listed around how you are going to perform the installation of a geyser, not just the installation itself. And again, this is where we start becoming a little bit more site specific, taking into account the method of the installation around the actual geyser itself. Then we look at having our safety files with policies and safe working procedures, as well as the inductions that we need to have on site and any permits that we might need. We then now need to list the steps from the client's perspective. What has your client required you to perform while being on site? Or perhaps there's certain personal protective equipment that they require you to use. Perhaps they are asking you to come into a confined space, or you need to install the geyser while working at heights. Perhaps you're going to be working outside where weather conditions become a hazard. Now it becomes a lot more site specific. So now we're starting to understand a basic template of a risk assessment is fine and well. And yes, we don't want to advocate the copy and paste form of risk management. Yet a lot of the things that you are doing is actually going to be taken from one task to the other. The installation of the geyser itself is probably never going to change. The way that geyser is installed from a piping perspective or bolting it onto a wall or similar type of structure is all going to remain relatively the same. So yes, you can always use that same template. However, we want to ensure that legal compliance items are covered And then also the site conditions and client site specifications are also included, because every installation of a geyser may be the same in theory, but practically we know that they are always different. And thus, your risk assessment should also always be different. Not 100% different, but certain aspects of your risk assessment will definitely change. Well, now we take a look at the actual task, the task of taking a geyser and installing it. Well, for one, there's manual handling that becomes a hazard. This is transporting the actual tools and equipment to install this geyser from your buckies or from the transporting truck to the area of where it's going to be installed. Then all of us know that while installing something, especially if it's a geyser, there's hand tools such as plumbing pliers, screwdrivers, hammers, whatever you are using yourself as hand tools. And then there's also portable electrical tools such as a drill or a grinder that may be needed. Then the actual installation of the geyser itself, the geyser components, perhaps you need to solder copper piping. Now you'll notice there's an asterisk on top of copper piping, and this comes back to a legal compliance risk that we need to note. So if you can, perhaps think to yourself, what is a very important hazard or risk that is associated when we solder copper piping? It's something that we would need in our safety file, and it comes along with the setup of legal compliance in the first step that we mentioned. So maybe you can think about that for a second. If you do have fast hands and you're quicker than me to show you the answer, maybe you can just type it into the answer and tell us, what would you think is the main risk that you are working with in soldering copper piping? We'll give you a little bit of time while we continue. We take a look at the installation again, water. A geyser needs water. Perhaps you're tying into an existing pipe where you need to isolate the water first before connecting it, or perhaps it's a new water line and there's no current water in it. But by the time you leave, you're going to need to fill that geyser. So water becomes a hazard as well, especially excess or leaking or water laying on the floor. Then lifting the actual geyser to place. Geysers are not always very light. I've lifted one or two myself, and I've realized that you always need assistance when lifting a geyser. Fastening the geyser while it's being lifted in place. Perhaps there's brackets or a frame that needs to go in first. Then we need to commission the actual system to check whether there are any leaks or any issues with the installation. We then test the actual geyser, and then there's COCs. COCs could be for the actual geyser installation, or perhaps it could even be for the electrical side. If you are a plumber that's doing the electrical as well, well, then there's a whole lot of additional hazards that also come into play. Working with electricity and also connecting electricity and conducting live electricity to a piece of equipment. If you are not the person involved in electrical work and you are just installing the actual geyser, well, then you have less hazards or less risks. But the process is still the same. All of these steps still need to be completed. And then once the geyser is installed, does that mean your risk ends? Well, no, not really, because when you complete the actual installation, the cleaning up of the area becomes extremely important. Now, the reason for this is because any excess water, tools laying around, debris, or even packaging that we have used, that we have brought into the place, adds additional hazards in and around the area for us. And we'll actually take a look at that a little bit more closer to the time. But when it comes to soldering copper piping, if you mentioned that it is hot works, well, then you would be correct. Obviously, while soldering, you are going to be using some sort of hot work. Obviously, a hot work is something that is extremely dangerous because it is an open flame or an open heat source that has the potential to create a fire. And since this is the case, a hot work permit is generally required. And this comes back to your compliance setup. If you know that you are going to be having hot works, just from the outset, ensure that it is part of your list. And then also make it part of your risk assessment. So once we've identified the actual hazards, we've now taken a look at the risks of these installation of a geyser. And we have a step-by-step procedure, and it's going to be a lot more detailed than what you see on the screen at the moment. Fixing the geyser to the wall or similar structure, connecting the piping, hot or cold, depending on what type of geyser you're installing, connecting all the fittings, your pressure valves, overflow valves, all of that. Then you might be installing the electricity, as we mentioned. Then you're going to test, and then you're going to actually clean up. Within these 5 steps, there could be multiple steps within each of them. So obviously your risk assessment is going to look very similar. And also for each of the steps, there's a number of different hazards. For instance, fixing a geyser to a wall could mean that you are working at heights, or perhaps you are working on a scaffold or a platform. Well, then you have the hazard and danger and risk of things falling. Initially, we would always want to look at the safety of a person. So high on our priority list, or high on the hazard list, is the falling of employees to a lower level. Then second to that would be the actual equipment that might fall. All right, so if somebody is working underneath you, that is also endangering a person's life. Again, that is the main priority. That is what we should, in fact, eliminate completely if we can. Then the falling of objects, perhaps the tools or equipment that you are using. These things might fall and drop to a lower level. Slightly lower on the risk compared to ourselves as workers or the actual geyser itself falling, but still a risk nonetheless. And then perhaps the scaffolding is not installed correctly or erected properly. Well, this could collapse and also cause the falling of employees, tools, and equipment. So you can see that just from one simple step, multiple hazards and risks will arise. When you connect piping to that geyser, well, is it just something as simple as putting 2 pipes together? Well, no, as we mentioned, there might be hot works. If you are not using any hot works and it's just a seal fitting that you are putting on, well, then there's pinch points because a lot of us don't like to wear gloves while working because it affects the way we actually use our tools. Well, this becomes dangerous because now our fingers could be caught into places where it could create a pinch point, and then we are just setting ourselves up for these minor injuries that could lead in a later stage to something more major. Because we are forgetting the small things, we tend to slowly start becoming complacent and forgetting the bigger things. But now the next 2 steps, I'd like to ask you as the plumbers out in the industry, what are the risks, hazards, or dangers that you would foresee when connecting fittings, such as your pressure valve, your overflow valves, overflow pipes, things like that, or when you are actually testing the geyser? And you don't have to answer it right now. Perhaps you want to drop us a mail and actually list some of the dangers that you find. And this is where we're asking for gaps to be filled from our side. So we've got a reasonable good idea of what these risks and hazards that are associated with this type of installation are, but we'd always like to hear from you, the audience. Because you are doing this every day, you perhaps have found something different, something new. And because we don't know everything, we always want to learn. So if you do have information, or even if it's the same information, doesn't matter, send it to us. Send us this information so we can see exactly what you guys are exposed to out in the industry. But let us take a look at the last one, cleaning up. Now this type of hazard becomes a slip and trip hazard, and you've heard this before. Slipping and tripping is one of the most common injuries in the workplace, just purely because of complacency. Now with any one of these tasks, or with any one of these hazards and risks that we mentioned, there is a safe working procedure. There is a way to perform it safely. It does take a little bit of forethought, a little bit of planning, and oftentimes we need to take a little bit of time to ensure it is being done properly. So not too much time, but it takes time. So we need to prepare properly. And this is where the PDCA comes in. And all of us can use this principle. Plan to perform the installation. Then while you are doing the installation of the geyser, constantly check whether you are abiding by the risk assessment, working according to the safe working procedures, and always check whether the quality and safety is being upheld. If you find a gap, act on it. And once you act on it, you then create another plan in order to rectify what you have found. And once you have done that, you actually perform the task again, you redo it safer if you can, but again, constantly checking whether it's done right. If you find a gap, act on it again. Make the plan to rectify it. Do it and then check. And hopefully, after this continual development of safe working procedures, you will get to a resolution of a safe working procedure that is best practice for you. So every single risk, every hazard, and for every task, there is a safe method. The one example of cleaning up after ourselves is an extremely important one. All of us can slip and trip over debris, tools that are being left around, excess water that may have spilt out and that has not been cleaned up. Or perhaps they are packaging that we have taken the geyser or the tools or equipment out of. They are also being left around and we could slip or trip over these. So housekeeping is the principle that we want to remember, something that a lot of us forget in our risk assessment. It should always be included there, that while we clean up or before we exit the site, we want to ensure the place is clean for ourselves as well as for our client. And another hazard that goes without saying, aside from the health and safety, is the quality and the confidence that clients have in us when we leave their site. Do they want us back because we are a quality product, a good installation, doing it safe, but also leaving their place clean? Well, this goes without saying that we want to ensure that our name is also of quality. So that's how we would go about performing a risk assessment. And as we mentioned, you will not be left with a completed risk assessment by the end of this toolbox talk, but you'll have a little bit more of an idea of what steps you should take in designing, compiling, identifying, and analyzing the risks and hazards in your environment. If you need help, you always are welcome to call us. Drop us a mail, safety@iopsa.org, info@ohss.co.za, or give us a WhatsApp message on 071 875 2070. And as always, there is the free occupational health and safety training for IOPSA members only. So please remember, if you are an IOPSA member, you do have free courses. That is the first aid and firefighting courses happening throughout the year of 2019. We are going to be in Cape Town this month. I can't believe it is July already. And then in the 5th of August, the week of the 5th of August, we will be down in KZN. So if you'd like to send some of your staff for that, please drop us a mail, chris@ohss.co.za. If you have more than 2 people, get in touch with us. We do have excellent discounts on these courses as well if you are an IOPSA, FEM, or SIOSH member. So if you don't qualify for the free courses, you still do qualify for the discounts from where these courses are held. The service providers that we have solidified for you as IOPSA, FEM, and SIOSH members are giving some great specials to you just purely because you are supported by FEM, IOPSA, as well as SIOSH. So thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed the Toolbox Talk for this morning, and we look forward to seeing you next week for the next topic on access scaffolding. How do we go about ensuring the scaffolding that we are using when on site is right, whether you are the one installing it or whether you are just working on it? Ensure it is safe to use. Thank you very much, Sean. I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Chris. We do not have any questions this morning. We do just have one of the, we just have a comment from one of the audience members that risk you were referring to is the inhalation of fumes, or HCS. But other than that,
thank you very much,
guys.
Yes, definitely a good one there. Thank you very much, Sean.
All right, perfect. Thanks, guys, for joining us this morning. I am going to go ahead and end the session off now. Do remember, if you are a SIOSH member, you can go ahead and put your registration number in the survey that follows. And if not, guys, if you could just take the 30 seconds just to answer those questions so that we can improve our service as well. Other than that, guys, I'm going to say thank you, Chris, for taking the time to actually prepare the session. And guys, enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks so much again for joining us. Bye-bye.